Welcome everyone. This is a detailed video of all the things that I learned about Dark Souls 3 based on my 9 hours spent with the network stress test that was hosted from 16th to 18th of October 2015 on PlayStation 4. It's good to remember that all the things you see here are still subject to change, because it's a very small portion of a currently unfinished game. I tried to share as many details about the network test in this video as possible, so naturally this video is quite long. So feel free to use the shortcuts in the video description to find the things you're looking for. The video contains my in-depth thoughts on gameplay, visuals and the PvP, and also showcases all the items, enemies, magic and full weapon movesets that were available in the network test. Before I start, I want to thank YouTube user Ruben Karp, who made all this possible for me in the first place. Please enjoy the video. It's very clear right from the beginning of the network test that this is pure Souls level art direction. Everything looks beautiful and detailed with massive backdrops of clouds and castles in the distance. But the High Wall of Lothric, the location where the network test took place, is surrounded with this bleak end of times atmosphere. Towers and walls are grumbling and corpses of dead dragons slowly decayed, releasing ash in the surrounding air. It's also very grey in color tone, kinda like Demon Souls. Now, it's been long known that From Software is aiming for 30 frames per second with this title. But in the network test at least, the game struggled to maintain even that, dipping often very noticeably under 30. While I'm not the part of 60 FPS minimum religion, I cannot deny that those drops hurt the visuals of the game. If it helps you though, you can actually see why they are aiming for 30 FPS, because the game is downright gorgeous. The amount of detail is great, there's a lot of really neat particle effects of smoke, sparks, fire, etc. Lighting is very pleasant and the creature design, for what little there was of it in the network test area, seemed very promising, although those mainly consisted of different hollows and knights. Animation quality is once again top notch as well, although little off looking while moving sideways while locked onto your enemy. There's none of that floatiness from Dark Souls 2, however. Another graphical flaw that the game has on top of the underwhelming frame rate is the same issue that Bloodborne had, which is the jagged edges on distant objects, since the game seems to lack proper anti-aliasing. I do not see the frame rate or jagged edges being an issue for the PC version of the game, however. HUD elements are very similar to the earlier Souls games. If I would have to compare the visual quality of the game to something, I would say it's almost identical to Bloodborne in that sense. There were also many noticeable reused assets from Bloodborne in the network test, like grass, ladders, elevators and so on, which is understandable since, as I've understood it, these two games were worked on simultaneously by From Software. Sound design is very solid as you would expect from a Souls game, and all 3 songs heard on title screen, character selection screen and in the boss fight all sound very promising. It's almost like Bloodborne style music with a medieval vibe to it. Network test provided one area to play in, the High Wall of Lothric, that was clearly cut out of something a lot bigger, since there were many obvious blockades preventing players from wandering deeper into the level. However, as small as the play area for the network test was, it already demonstrated enough to show people that this is true Dark Souls level design again. There was a lot of elevation in the level and many shortcuts you could open to circle back where you came from with ease. If you were careful, you could observe the areas ahead to spot upcoming danger. And on the other hand, if you were not careful, you could still, well, get fucked. I've heard some talk about the enemy AI being more polished, but to be quite honest, I didn't really see this. Same old tricks from the other Souls games still work. However, some of the enemies had quite effective backstab defense maneuvers. Some enemies also patrolled the areas instead of being stationary. You also got ambushed constantly if you weren't careful. A small addition that is worth noting were these little gravestones that could be found all around the network test area, that had vague bits of lore in them. If you have experience of earlier Souls games, you're right at home with the combat system. And while the gameplay is most reminiscent from Dark Souls 1, it feels like it has a bit of something from every previous Souls title. Attack speeds and animations are almost identical to Dark Souls, movement and rolling speed seems closer to Demon Souls, and you can sprint to any direction while locked on like in Dark Souls 2. Even the charged heavy attacks from Bloodborne make a return. This doesn't mean, however, that Dark Souls 3 doesn't have any new tricks up its sleeve. The most noticeable change when it comes to combat would have to be the weapon arts, which work in a very peculiar way. Each weapon seemed to have their own weapon arts activated with the left trigger. Some of the arts were just different attacks, some put you in the stance that allowed you to use different attacks, and some weapon arts buffed your character in some way. Weapon arts seemed extremely useful, and you can see more presentation of those in the moveset showcase portion of this video. But I cannot wait to see what kind of different weapon arts exists in the final game. Weapon arts are not free, however, and all of those also used mana. Oh yeah, mana bar has replaced the numbered uses of spells, and so far it seems like a very natural change to me. It's even supported by Ash Estus Flask provided to players, which acts like your normal Estus Flask, but instead of replenishing your health, it replenishes your mana bar. Casting in general was very similar to Dark Souls, down to animations, to casting time, and even the spells that were available. One new spell was available for the Academy Assassin class, called the Soul Dart, which shot very fast, ranged but weak magic missile that dealt third of the damage of a normal soul arrow, and didn't stagger any of the enemies. Castings also had the left trigger option available. For the Academy Assassin, which was the sorcerer class, this buffed the damage for your next spellcast. For Herald of White, that was the cleric class, this provided either hyper armor or poise for the miracles. I'm not quite sure which, since it's hard to determine how the poise works yet. You could also delay the miracle castings by holding down the cast button. Talking about poise, it seemed that you get stunned by just about everything that hit you in the network test, in both PvP and PvE. But some attacks or weapons had hyper armor, meaning while you were performing that attack, you couldn't get staggered. Stunlocks didn't seem to exist either, and you were always able to get out after taking 2 hits. This was different though if you were attacked by multiple enemies at a time. Kick is also back, and works as you would expect it to, but it's slower than in Dark Souls. Not quite as slow as the guard break animation was in Dark Souls 2, but something in between those two. There was one aspect of the kick that was quite alarming, but I'll talk more about that in the PvP section of this video. You can use the kick to stagger enemies or kick away their shields. If the enemy runs out of stamina while getting kicked or by other means, you can riposte them, just like in Dark Souls 2. Parrying feels very good in the game, and those who felt that the timings of Dark Souls 2 for parrying were strange can be at peace now, since the parry timing is very natural. You see the enemy start their attack, you push the parry button, that's it. Not all shields can parry, however. Smaller shields had parry mapped to left trigger, but bigger shields were much more effective for blocking and allowed the usage of weapon arts even if you didn't two-hand your weapon. This might be something that some of the players need a bit time to get used to, but for me it is very natural trade-off, especially now that parry and weapon arts both seem very strong tools in combat. It also seems that partially parrying enemies' attacks happen a lot more often now. I wonder if they increased the amount of partial parry frames. They also took very interesting approach with how the backstabs work in the game. While it seemed from the first gameplay trailers that the instant backstabs from Dark Souls are back, this is quite not the case. The way the backstab works now is that in order for you to land a successful backstab, your enemy needs to be in the middle of an attack or be completely stationary. The backstab animation start is instant, but while the animation plays while a player is getting backstabbed, if you move away it becomes just a normal attack. It's a bit hard to explain, but I'll try to go more in depth about it in the PvP section of this video. Only other thing that comes in mind that has changed in the gameplay mechanics is that running and backstep R2s now activate jump attacks with every single weapon. At first this felt a bit weird to me, but in the end I loved this change. It provides you with easier tool to surprise the opponents who think they will parry your running attacks. PvP invasions worked in a weird way in the network test that got me a bit worried. It seemed that you were only able to invade players who had summoned at least one phantom to help them, but most of the times it was 3 phantoms and the host. This is not all, however. In order for players to summon help, they need to use the new items called Embers, which grants the players somewhere from 30 to 40% extra health. So in most cases, as an invader, you needed to deal with a host who has more health than you, plus his phantom friends. I'm not sure why they seem to take the same approach as Bloodborne had, that was almost universally hated. Now, I realized that invaders can use the enemies to even up the odds, but this is still just silly. At least invaders can use Estus now, which is great. I bet that there is going to be a red sign equivalent in the game, so the fight clubs don't die out, but I hope they do not repeat the same mistakes from Bloodborne and kill random invasions for people. The game seemed to have some frame rate drops while I invaded a world with a lot of phantoms in it, but nothing as serious as what Bloodborne had in the similar scenario. So, how did the PvP actually play? For the most part, great. I had a great time with the small amount of PvP I was able to get, and it feels like a very natural progression from the earlier games. Hitboxes seemed very accurate, and you were able to direct your attacks flawlessly, which I really missed in Dark Souls 2 that somewhat limited that. The lockdown movement combines elements from Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 very pleasantly, meaning that you have your normal Dark Souls movement as long as you are not running. But if you start running while locked on, you can move to every direction. It was also very nice to see charged R2 attacks finally getting their way into Dark Souls PvP as well. Rolling seemed to be ridiculously strong, and you were only vulnerable in last couple of frames in the end of the roll animation. Weapon art seemed like a cool and viable addition to PvP as well, adding just another layer of the already deep combat system. It's still a mystery how poise works, but for now it seems like something similar to the hyper armor system from Bloodborne, which in my opinion worked great. But what about the backstabs? Backstabs are handled in a very interesting way in this game, it seems. First of all, the backstab hitbox seems to be quite smaller now, so you really need to actually be directly behind the other player's back to pull one off. But that's not all. Backstabs are not instant either, and can only be performed on a stationary target or a player who is in the middle of an attack. If your target moves away in time, your backstab animation still happens, but it comes out as a normal attack. Something worth noting is that I got both poise and roll backstab during my PvP testings, so both of these are still somewhat possible. How I would say the future of the backstabs is that it mainly acts as a tool to punish parrying attempts, because that seems the most natural use for it. For now. And while we're talking about parrying, I must say that parrying feels very strong. The timing for parrying this time is very close to the PvE parrying, means that you can parry things with reaction. Some people are saying that the timing is identical to Dark Souls PvP parrying, but to me it does feel a lot more tight. Tight meaning more accurate. In Dark Souls there was this set amount of latency you had to get used to when parrying. After that, parrying became very reliable, if not a bit dependent on prediction though. But in network test, when I used Dark Souls parrying timings taking account to that latency, I failed my parries being too early. However, when I parried on reaction, I landed them. So the parry timing seems to be more accurate on what is actually happening in the screen. Now remember that this was only in a network test and not fully representing the final product. But for now, it seems that kicks can be parried. I saw this happen to a fellow Souls player, RB Frosty, and it was clear as a day, you could parry kicks. This is something I really want to go away in the final version of the game, because kick has always been the most valuable tool to counter parrying. And while parrying seems as strong as it is now, it doesn't need another buff like this. Most of the spells available in the network test seemed quite underwhelming in PvP situation, although it was satisfying to hit all the people in a 4-man gank squad with one sweep of the Soul Greatsword. From a bit more advanced PvP techniques, I can say this. Toggle escape is gone, animation cancels are gone, Ravioli step doesn't work with normal attacks, however you can ravioli jump attack weirdly enough. And dead angle is still a bit of a question mark, but I could have swore I saw someone get dead angled while I hosted fights. I also hear that parry backstab is back, but take this info with a grain of salt, because I personally didn't test this. Overall, I see myself enjoying the PvP in the final game a lot, and I cannot wait to see what they did with the stats, since we weren't able to access the character stat sheets in the network test at all. I just hope that some of the changes they made are not here to stay, like the only being able to invade gang squads. There isn't much I can say about the co-op other than it works. You can now summon 3 phantoms to help you and be invaded by 2 hostile dark spirits. thank you so much everyone for watching, and I personally cannot wait to get my hands on Dark Souls 3 on 2016. If you were left with any questions you wanna ask, please put them in the comment section and I will answer them. Take care.